If you have questions or suggestions for future podcasts, please submit them in the comment section below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Competition is more effective than regulations. Hi, I'm Dave Arnott, the Christian Economist. Christians are called to take care of widows and orphans because in the agrarian economy of biblical times, those were the people who didn't own land, so they couldn't care for themselves. We can care for them today by two very different techniques: competition or regulation. Now, the problem is regulations are regressive, harming the poor more than the rich. They also exercise taxation without representation, and they sidestep the democratic process. University of Chicago economist Casey Mulligan has determined that the Biden administration's rulemaking has cost each American household more than $10,000, while the Trump administration's reduction of rules saved each household $11,000. Look, every American household has $21,000 less in purchasing power as a result of the change from a President Trump to a President Biden administration. As President Obama noticed, elections have consequences, and they matter most to the poor, who suffer a greater loss in purchasing power through regulations than the rich do. That's because $21,000 represents a higher proportion of income to the poor than the rich. But wait, it gets worse. To quote Mr. Mulligan directly from his letter to the Wall Street Journal, quote, "That would be more than $10,000 in cost for 2 years of President Biden's rulemaking that I examined, and almost $11,000 in savings for 4 years of President Trump's. Mr. Biden is adding regulatory cost even faster than President Obama did, while Mr. Trump reduced them," end quote from Mr. Mulligan. Opportunity cost. Now, the simple economics question is the juice worth the squeeze? It's what finance people call cost-benefit analysis. Well, we all make these decisions, large and small, on a daily basis. You skimmed the headline of today's podcast and decided the benefit you would receive from gaining the information is greater than the cost of spending the minutes to listen to it. In economics, we call that opportunity cost. You can't listen to another podcast at this moment because you're listening to this one. The federal government goes through a similar analysis performed by the Office of Management and Budget. They keep track of how many significant regulatory actions a president orders up. It's been defined as an order that costs American taxpayers $100 million or more. That's the squeeze. Now, the Biden administration wants to double it to $200 million. OMB also measures the juice that is produced from this squeeze. In the past, that benefit was accrued only to Americans, but being the global citizens they are, the Biden administration says those benefits can accrue from outside the U.S. See, President Trump wanted to make America great again, and the Biden administration wants to make the world great again. The current administration is tilting at a very large economic windmill. Justice would say that money forcefully extracted from American taxpayers should benefit Americans. If you really think money spent by taxpayers in one country should benefit those in another country, please preach that sermon in another country and convince them to appropriate funds that benefit Americans. No taxation without representation. Now, the phrase "no taxation without representation" first appeared in a London newspaper in 1768. As you may remember, the phrase caught on in the colonies and caused a revolution. It raised the question as to whether the Crown had the right to tax its colonial subjects. The colonists thought it did not. But that's exactly what's happening today. This is taxation without representation. Our forefathers fought a revolution over that idea. These are administrative orders that don't go through the democratic legislative process. They harm the poor, as I mentioned earlier, and the young. Americans can't vote until they're 18, but they have to pay for these regulatory costs in the form of decreased family spending power every year of their lives. So how many of those $100 million economically significant regulations are in the queue? Well, Clyde Wayne Cruz from the Competitive Enterprise Institute says the current administration has ordered up 297 of the whoppers, and they're averaging 97 a year. For comparison, the averages for Presidents Obama and George W. Bush were 69 and 49. See, it's all about power. Socialism starts and ends with power. The Biden administration has skipped over the democratic process of legislation because they see it as slow and cumbersome. President Biden learned from his predecessor Barack Obama, who proudly declared, "I have a pen and a phone. Who needs Congress?" President Trump has been labeled an egomaniacal narcissist, but he used his power to reduce the cost of regulations for the poor, while President Biden is using his power to increase costs for the poor. Who's really the egomaniacal narcissist here? The end of democracy. This is a classic example of creeping governmental excess. An agency, in this case, the Organization of Management and Budget, is created to watch over other agencies. Then the OMB is stripped of its power so the other agencies can do whatever they want. But did we recover the $141 million we're spending on the OMB? Nope, still there. As the Washington Post declares, quote, "Democracy dies in darkness," end quote. That light was previously shown by the OMB, which is being extinguished by the Biden administration. In Federalist Paper 51, James Madison wrote, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary." But they're not angels. So in a world of self-interested, fallen people, how should we distribute goods? The short answer is free market capitalism that forces suppliers to compete to serve demanders of the goods, and those are poor people, by the way. There is very little corruption in competitive markets. That's because corruption increases the price of the final goods, and self-interested demanders go to the lower cost suppliers. But government steps in and tries to regulate the market. Problem is, those agencies are populated by, guess what? Fallen people. So you need an agency to regulate the regulators. That's the OMB. Then the Biden administration comes along and neuters the top-level agencies, the OMB, and the lower-level regulators are empowered. Simple. Done. No more democracy. Competition is more effective than regulation. Now, this fallen nature problem has to be solved in some way. And there are two answers: competition or regulation. You know, I've often said the government should do more. About what? They should do more to maintain competition. Yeah, that's why I've produced at least 2 podcasts on antitrust. You see, antitrust activity by the government prevents concentration of markets. So that should be the government's main job in the economy, maintaining competition, because it's very hard to run a corrupt company when it's trying to compete. Yeah, this is the beauty of Adam Smith's observation in The Wealth of Nations in 1776. Okay, on this podcast, I'm going to get a twofer where one great economist cites another. Here you go. Milton Friedman said, quote, "It is the responsibility of the rest of us to establish a framework of law such that an individual in pursuing his own interest is," to quote Adam Smith again, "led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention," end quote. We're fallen and we can't get up. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Accent on the all of that scripture. That means business people are fallen and government regulators are fallen. So how do we produce and distribute goods and services in a scarce environment? Regulation is an attempt to control the fallen nature, but you're controlling it with fallen people. It's this whole downward spiral. You form a bureaucratic agency to regulate the economy, but then you have to regulate the regulators. Then you have to regulate the regulators who regulate the regulators. Yeah, a simpler tack is to make suppliers compete. When they compete, they are forced to serve the demander before they get served. Walmart's an example. They bought the land, they built the store, they hired the clerks, and stocked the place with about $7 million worth of goods. That's before they sell the first item. All I have to do is walk in, put something in my basket, and run it across the scanner. Walmart served the poor first. Then they got served. That's the reason, as a Christian economist, I always want to find a middle point between pure capitalism and pure socialism. See, at either end of the spectrum, they both produce monopolies, where the supplier is served before the demander. But a lightly regulated free market capitalist system produces the best outcome for all parties involved in the economic transaction. I'm Dave Arnott, the Christian economist. Fear God, tell the truth, earn a profit. See you next time. For more information, please visit us online at davearnott.com. If you have questions or suggestions for future podcasts, please submit them online or in the comments section below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.